it seems a little odd that having looked forward to leaving Egypt, both so that we shouldn't be in exile and we shouldn't be in servitude, nevertheless, as soon as we leave Egypt, we would imagine that the Jewish people would be so thankful to God that they would sing some kind of praise to God, but they don't. They only wait until the splitting of the sea, because it was really only with the splitting of the sea that their redemption was complete. And that more or less is the point of analysis of the article. The seventh day of Pesach commemorates the splitting of the Red Sea, the climax of the exodus from Egypt. Until Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, they remained in dread of Egypt's military might, to the extent that the sages tell us that the very reason why God made the Egyptians wash up on the seashore, which really is a little bit of an antithesis to the idea of honoring the form that is the human body by burying it as soon as possible, which, by the way, is not only an obligation for a Jewish person, but it's really part of the 7 Noahide laws as well. Man, whether Goy or Jew, is made in God's image, and therefore that should be respected when he passes away. It's a little strange that God would make dead bodies wash up onto the seashore rather than burying them in the actual water. But the reason why he did that was because unless and until the Jewish people saw the Egyptians actually dead, they weren't necessarily sure that they were drowned. As much as they saw the waters collapsing on them, in the same way as they got out, the Jewish people got out on the one side, on the new side, as it were, of the Red Sea, of the Sea of Reeds, it could be that at least some of the Egyptians were able to turn around and make it safely back to the side where they came from. And so in that regard, it's possible that they would again pursue them and again catch them a few days later or who knows when. And if there's this ongoing threat, or at least possible threat, their salvation is obviously not complete. Some were even prepared to submit to slavery again rather than risk death. If we remember, and we'll note more specifically a little bit later in the article, that there was this very kind of strange exchange between the Jewish people and Moses when they are faced with the dangers of the sea ahead of them and the Egyptian army behind them. They say to Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to take us out to the desert so that we should die here? They're obviously not really asking that question. It's not even a rhetorical question. It's basically just venting. They're scared, and that makes sense. And really all their leader would need to do, seemingly, is to just quiet them down, calm them down, reassure them, everything's going to be okay, let's be strong, something along those lines. But that's not what Moses does. Moses answers and gives this very extensive, almost convoluted answer. He says, stand firm and see the salvation that God will do for you today. That which you see Egypt today, you'll never see them again. God will fight for you, and you should remain quiet. In fact, the sages tell us that the Jewish people split up at that point into 4 different groups, 4 different opinions as to what to do in this scenario of distress. One group said, let us jump into the sea and die as free people. God wanted that we should be free. He obviously took us out of Egypt. Apparently, he didn't plan for that to stay very long. Only 7 days later, we're now in this situation. But God wants us to be free. We're going to be free. And so, let's jump into the sea as free people, masters of our own fate. To them, Moses says, no, stand firm and see the salvation that God will do for you today. Another group said, let's return to Egypt. That's the reference here. And to them, Moses says, that which you see Egypt today, you'll never see them again. In other words, you're not going back. Another group wanted to fight the Egyptians. And Moses says, no, God will fight for you. In other words, you don't have to worry about fighting. And another group, the last group, wanted to at least pray to God for salvation. And even to them, Moses says, no, God will fight for you. You should remain silent. After the splitting of the sea, however, all fear of danger ended and they experienced true freedom. Our sages consider these 2 events, the exodus from Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea, to be of such fundamental importance that they require us to recall them every day. In fact, there are passages or verses in the prayers that reference these two events, and they are required not only to be said because they're part of the prayers, but also while you are saying them to have in mind specifically the exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea. This obligation indicates that they are not simply incidents in history. Instead, the exodus from Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea reflect two continually relevant stages in our service of God. As much as that is true on an everyday basis, hence the obligation to remember them every day, it is even more so the case when it's the holiday that commemorates the particular event. If you remember, we discussed in the context of Purim, because it comes from the Megillah, from the book of Esther, that these days are remembered and re-experienced or relived. That is a verse regarding specifically the holiday and the celebration of Purim, but by extension, the commentaries tell us that it really applies to all of the holidays. When it comes to a particular holiday, when we remember properly, not just as a history lesson, but as something germane to us, the theme of the particular event that that holiday marks, in this case, for example, the seventh day of Passover marks the splitting of the Red Sea, then it is re-experienced by us on an every day and every year basis. Leaving Egypt means transcending our limitations and ceasing to be slaves by identifying ourselves as servants of God. That's what we discussed in the Seder, and also we discussed last time, that the sages say that in every generation, and the Alter Rebbe adds that in every day, a person should consider himself as if he himself left Egypt. And we asked the very simple question, I was never in Egypt, I was never a slave, it can't be fake, it's the Torah of truth, so what do the sages really intend with that requirement? And that's not only a requirement amongst the thousands of statements of the sages, that requirement, that statement is in the Haggadah, which means that it is an integral part of the experience of the Exodus as required to be retold on the night of the Seder. The Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, is the same or basically the same as the Hebrew word for limitations, Meitzorim. And now, based on that translation, we understand really what the sages mean. Obviously, you might not have been in the GPS location known as Egypt, and you might not have actually been enslaved with chains and shackles on your ankles. But everybody has limitations, almost entirely self-imposed or artificially imposed and not real. Leaving or transcending those limitations is in fact leaving our personal Egypt. That is absolutely relevant to everybody in every time and in every place. And now we understand what the sages mean and why it's so important and therefore included in the Haggadah. The exodus from Egypt was not complete, however, until the splitting of the Red Sea. By the same token, on a personal level, each individual's experience of leaving Egypt is incomplete without the spiritual parallel to the splitting of the Red Sea. As much as we lay the groundwork for that exodus, for that leaving of our limitations, on the night of the first night and first days of Passover, where we experience the Exodus in the Seder, where we leave Egypt, the fact is that just as 3,300 years ago, that would not have been enough. The Egyptians would have caught us and brought us back to Egypt or killed us, and we needed the additional step of the splitting of the sea and the drowning of the Egyptians. So too in our spiritual service, the first days of Passover and their theme is not enough for the overall experience of Passover. Rather, we need that second set of days as well. The commitment to leave Egypt, to transcend the limits of our individual selves, often poses a problem for even those who are firmly committed to Torah practice, experience the material world as their frame of reference. Everybody has certain axioms, a certain box that they live in. Even those people who are cognizant and devoted to the code of Jewish law, they will see, for example, their schedule as immutable, right? Something that I can't change, and therefore, when there is an additional opportunity to learn Torah, they're not even considering the possibility of joining that class because to them, they're too busy. Are they committed to learning Torah? Certainly. Are they committed to learning Torah in the full sense of even if it appears as if I can't, but I should, and therefore I will? Maybe not. Mitzrayim, Egypt in Hebrew, symbol of the limitations of our worldly existence, determines their worldview. Many may find themselves in a quandary. On the one hand, they are committed to Torah observance. At the same time, however, their worldview inhibits the expression of this commitment by making the fulfillment of Torah and commandments appear to be an obligation which reaches beyond the framework of everyday existence. When we go back to the actual story of the splitting of the sea, they saw the waters in front of them and the Egyptians behind them, and they said, look, maybe we have to jump into the water. Suicide is prohibited in Judaism, even as far as the 7 Noahide laws are concerned. How in the world could somebody, a group of people in this case, who saw open miracles from God, were clearly devoted to God, how could they consider doing something contrary to God's will? They thought, look, God took me out of Egypt, took us out of Egypt, yes, but he also, by divine providence, put us in the scenario where we have no choice but to jump into the water. And so, God himself made it that that's the scenario. That is all the perspective based on what I see is real, but maybe not. In a more modern example, when the massive immigration of the European Jewry came to America pretty much at the turn of the century, about 100 years ago or so, there were many who couldn't keep Shabbat because if they didn't come to work on Saturday, they were fired. And so they said, look, God himself put me in a scenario where I cannot provide for my family unless I do something that otherwise would be prohibited on Shabbat. And so they violated Shabbat. That's all, again, the perspective based on the acceptance of the axiom that my boss provides my sustenance and not God through my boss. Those that were able to have the more accurate perspective, a more maybe clearer perspective, they did whatever they could to make a living, of course, but they never worked on Shabbat. They never violated Shabbat because after all is said and done, you can't violate Shabbat. This conflict between worldview and practice runs counter to the fundamental tenets of Judaism. Although it is far easier to live spiritually by rejecting the material world, Judaism firmly condemns asceticism and warns against abandoning the realities of life. Even the holiest person in the generation, the one who's going to serve in the temple, the Kohen Gadol, has to be married. He has to be married because the idea of Judaism is not spirituality. The idea of Judaism is holiness. Holiness is spirituality in a material context. One of the first examples of this is when a person gets married. When a person gets married under the chuppah, the man places a ring on the finger of his bride, and he says, "Hareat mikudeshes li betabas zu kidas meshav Yisrael." Behold, you are betrothed or engaged to me with this ring according to the law of Moses and Israel. Mikudeshes, what generally is rendered as betrothed, really technically, denotationally, is translated as sanctified, made holy. And our sages explain why that's the verbiage. There are many women in the world, but you and you alone are my wife. There are many men in the world, but I and I alone am your husband. Without that contrast of many men, but I am your husband, many women, but you are my wife, there is no concept of holy. Spiritual maybe, but holiness is only when you have spirituality in that material context. Judaism requires a person to rise above his material concerns within the context of his daily existence, to engage in all of his deeds for the sake of heaven, while remaining soberly in touch with the world around him. In fact, the sages point out that the real way that we exhibit devotion to God, service of God, is not by doing the rituals that are the commandments. It's more or less expected that if God says do something or don't do something, you're going to follow whatever he requires. The real show of devotion and of service, the way that the verse terms that you should know him, or that all of your actions should be, as it says here, for the sake of heaven, the main word in those phrases, whether it's the verse or the statement from the sages, is the word your. In all of your ways you shall know him. All of your actions should be for the sake of heaven. It's not his ways or his actions, namely the commandments, but rather your ways and your actions, those things that are otherwise your choice as to what to do, mundane aspects and endeavors in your life that are directed towards heaven, that are directed for God's sake. That's how we know that you know him. Because even those things that otherwise are, as it were, your free time, which of course doesn't actually exist, is directed to Hashem. The difficulty of rejecting worldliness while living within a material framework parallels the spiritual hurdle faced by the Jews after leaving Egypt, but before the splitting of the Red Sea. Although they had physically departed Egypt, Egypt was still a part of them. This is the crux of the challenge. Often, if it is a person's internalization of his environment and not its objective reality, which presents him with the most formidable challenges in his service of God. For example, we learned earlier the sages example of a thief who prays to God for success before breaking into someone's house. He obviously believes in God and that he prays to him, but he obviously didn't make that faith real or practical in that obviously he's doing something that is prohibited by God himself. Not only that, but he is doing this not necessarily because he wants to be a thief. It's dangerous. It could get you in trouble. It could get you killed. But it's because he doesn't think that God can provide him a sustenance, a livelihood, in a normal way. Either because somehow he doesn't think God can do it, or because he doesn't believe or recognize that his livelihood comes from God. That is the ultimate kind of dichotomy of theoretical faith without practical expression, where someone takes the world's scenario as reality, but not recognizing that it's not the objective reality, and that the person could make a living, and God would provide him a living if he were to not be a thief. As stated above, it was only after the splitting of the Red Sea that our people were able to break free from the invisible shackles that bound them to Egypt. Similarly, understanding the spiritual parallel to this miracle enables us to resolve the dichotomy between our environment and our spiritual goals, and gives us the potential to rise to the challenge of living spiritually in the material world. We find the miracle of the splitting of the sea described as follows. He turned the sea into dry land. The Talmud tells us that everything that God created on dry land, he also created in the sea. So for example, there's vegetation on dry land, there's vegetation on the seabed. There are land animals on dry land, there are animals that go on the bottom of the water. There are birds, which are obviously above the dry land. There are fish, which are above the seabed. The big difference, though, is that all of what was created on dry land I can see, but what is on the seabed or in the water, I can't see. Looking at the water, looking at the Bay of Green Bay or some ocean or whatever, I just see water. I might know that there's something in there, but I don't see it. It's certainly not the way it's presented to me. When the sea is split, and more specifically when the seabed is dry, that means that this curtain is pulled back. The water no longer covers that which is inside of it. So much so, in the example of this, that there was no water left, no wetness left in the seabed. It was completely dry. So as to explain that none of the veil remains there at all. In Hasidic thought, the sea serves as a metaphor for the material world which hides the godliness within it. Like the waters of the ocean, which cover over whatever is within them, our material existence conceals the godly life force which maintains its existence. The transformation of the sea into dry land symbolizes the revelation of this hidden truth, demonstrating that the world is not separate from God, but rather unified with him entirely. Perceiving God's integrated involvement in our physical world enables us to overcome the challenge posed by our material environment. As long as our faith in God is abstract, removed from experience, it is disconnected from our day-to-day existence. However, when we recognize God's constant presence and influence in our lives, we are able to see his Torah as a means of establishing a connection with him as we continue our day-to-day lives. That's the reason why every single commandment is, by definition, a practical act, either required or prohibited, with a physical object. Even commandments like loving God or loving your fellow as yourself or being in awe of God or any of those kinds of more kind of feeling commandments, the sages tell us, the commentaries tell us, that they are not fulfilled unless and until you practice what you're feeling. Your behavior has to be in accordance with loving your fellow as yourself. And only then, when you actually do something or don't do something if it's contrary to whatever the requirement is, only then do you actually fulfill that commandment. In this manner, our spiritual service reflects the cycle of historical events experienced by our people. The miracle at the Red Sea completed the process begun by the Exodus from Egypt and prepared the Jews for the giving of the Torah. By the same token, each person's individual exodus from Egypt is reinforced by his recognition of God's constant presence, a recognition of the kind represented by the splitting of the sea. This sense of God's presence brings about a renewed commitment to the Torah and its commandments. The narrative of the splitting of the Red Sea teaches another important lesson about the extent of our commitment to the service of God. The miracle at the Red Sea was a direct response to the actions of the Jewish people. Not just that Moses raised his staff and then the water split. The sages tell us a backstory. That at the time, at the very moment that Moses raises his staff, another incident occurs. The Torah relates that when the Jews found themselves trapped between the pursuing Egyptian army and the Red Sea, they became greatly frightened and cried out to God. Remember that there were those 4 opinions, what should we do? Moses says no to all of them, and some of them that makes a little bit more sense than others. One of the opinions, though, was to pray to God for salvation, and even to that, Moses says no. Prayer, by definition, is when I need or want something, I turn to God and ask for it. Organized prayer, as far as morning, afternoon, evening, prayer book, stand, sit, all that is rabbinic in nature, but the basis of prayer is to turn to God and ask for whatever you need. And in this case, it's not whatever one person needs, it's what the whole of the nation needs. And it's not just what the whole of the nation needs, it's basic survival of that nation. If there was ever an example where it seems to be right to pray, this is it. And nevertheless, God says, no. Moses says, no. What's wrong with prayer? God responded by telling Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. The reason why all 4 proposed solutions, jumping into the water, going back into Egypt, fighting the Egyptians, or even prayer, why all 4 of them are wrong, isn't because of what they themselves propose. Again, prayer is good. It is because they are all based on solving a problem. We're trapped between the waters in front of us and the Egyptians behind us. But the reality is, not the what's presented, but the reality is that there is no problem. God said, I'm going to take you out of Egypt to bring you to the land, to bring you to Mount Sinai and then to the land of Israel. What are you all concerned about? There's water in front of you? I've handled bigger deals. Why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward. There's nothing to solve here, so any proposed solution is by definition wrong. Our sages explained that after Moses relayed this message, Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, the leader of the tribe of Judah, by the way, the tribe from where we get Mashiach, plunged into the Red Sea while the water was still there. The water hadn't yet split. Followed by his tribe and then by the entire Jewish people. They pressed onward until the water reached their nostrils. Only then did the sea split. And that's exactly when Moses raises his staff. So it's because of Nachshon, because he was willing to just go, even though the water was still there, and what was being presented to him was basically suicide, nevertheless, God said, go, I go. Nachshon's action exemplified Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice. He knew that the goal of the Exodus was the giving of the Torah, for God had promised Moses, when you bring the people out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. That's the mountain of Mount Sinai. Accordingly, Nachshon's only desire was to reach Mount Sinai. No matter what the obstacles, his resolve would not be shaken. Not even the sea would stand between himself and receiving the Torah. The outstanding quality of Nachshon's divine service can be further understood by a comparison between Rabbi Akiva and our patriarch Abraham. Both lived lives of Mesiras Nefesh, serving God and teaching his Torah with complete self-sacrifice. Abraham, of course, was the only monotheist at the time, and he was not only threatened, but actually thrown into a fiery furnace for teaching monotheism. Rabbi Akiva was one of what's called the 10 martyrs who was actually killed for teaching Torah during the times of the Romans. They differed, however, in the nature of their commitments. Both committed to serving God, but in two very different ways. In defiance of Roman decrees, Rabbi Akiva continued to teach his students. When the Romans captured him, they tortured him to death with combs of iron. In his ordeal, basically right as he was about to pass away, Rabbi Akiva uttered the words of Shema. His students were astounded by his devoutness. He explained, "All my life I've been troubled by the command in the Shema itself to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." The all your soul part, he understood to mean to love God even if he takes your soul. Not only is this just his opinion, but it is what Rashi explains that clause to mean, which means that it is the basic, simple, fundamental meaning of the verse. And I used to say, Rabbi Akiva says, I used to say, when shall I have the opportunity to fulfilling this? In other words, actually giving my life, that God should take my soul, to show that I love him that much. Rabbi Akiva then sought self-sacrifice all his life, regarding it as the ultimate height to which man could aspire. He wanted to die for God. Unlike Rabbi Akiva, Abraham did not regard self-sacrifice as an end in itself. His life was totally dedicated to the mission of spreading the awareness of God. If the task called for self-sacrifice, literally giving your life, he was prepared to sacrifice his life, as when he was challenged by Nimrod, who cast him into a furnace of fire. He did not, however, strive to attain self-sacrifice. His efforts were dedicated solely to making the world a dwelling place for God. Why the difference between these two approaches? Rabbi Akiva desired self-sacrifice because he saw it as the greatest possible form of self-fulfillment. Instead of seeking self-fulfillment in material things, which obviously in comparison to spirituality is very, very insignificant, or even in a limited spiritual service, which is a little bit better than material, he sought complete union with God, fundamentally giving my entire self, my literal physical life. He understood that since God is infinite, the only way a finite human being could experience total union with him would be through self-sacrifice, literally sacrificing his life. That notwithstanding, he was dictating, at least to some extent, to God how he wanted to serve him. Self-fulfillment is based on self. In this regard, it's the highest form of self-fulfillment. That's all fine and good, but nevertheless, there is that tinge of self. Abraham, by contrast, was not concerned with self-fulfillment at all. If he needed to be doing self-sacrifice, if God put him in that scenario, fine. But I'm not telling God how to serve me. I'm serving God in any and all scenarios that he puts me in. He had only one goal, the mission with which God had charged him. A similar quality characterized Nachshon. When he plunged into the sea, he did not think of himself or his self-fulfillment, whether material or spiritual. He didn't think of the fact that he was seemingly giving his life. He was conscious of only one thing, God's commandment to proceed to the giving of the Torah. In our own lives, recalling the splitting of the Red Sea teaches us to strive for selfless determination. The exile in Egypt prepared our people for the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. The present exile is also a preparation readying us for the revelation of new dimensions within the Torah by Mashiach. We, like Nachshon and Avraham, have been given a mission to prepare the world for the coming of Mashiach by disseminating the knowledge of the Torah and its commandments. Nachshon's steadfast commitment brought about a miraculous salvation for the Jewish people. Emulating his commitment will likewise prepare us for the miracles of the era of the redemption, which will include a parallel to the miracle of the splitting of the sea. As the Haftarah recited on the 8th day of Passover relates, God will raise his hand over the river, the Euphrates, with his mighty wind and smite it into 7 streams, which obviously is a parallel to how the waters of the Sea of Reeds were split also into channels. May this prophecy be fulfilled speedily in our days.